CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.
Helping you lead a healthier life. This is CURES.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the CURES Show, where we explore the cutting edge of wellness for our mind, body, and spirit. I'm Kara Sundlin. So often in the news, we're hearing about domestic violence, but we don't always include verbal abuse, from gaslighting to criticism, even the silent treatment. What really constitutes verbal abuse? And how do you stop it? Dr. Laura Saunders from the Institute of Living in Hartford is joining us now to help us learn more. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you for having me, Kara.
I think, we all know that we probably mess up sometimes, or we get our feelings hurt by what people say. But verbal abuse is really a type of abuse that can be damaging, that you say we often don't talk about it enough.
We definitely don't talk about it enough. And while domestic violence, rightfully so, gets our attention and gets headlines because it is a very serious problem that needs to be talked more about. What doesn't get as much mention, but can be equally as damaging, is really verbal abuse. And what we're talking about is verbal abuse that tends to be more chronic and debilitating, right? So verbal abuse is a form of bullying that often happens in relationships, families, sometimes friendships. It's known as emotional abuse. It can be, a range of words or behaviors, from manipulation and intimidation. And it really is about maintaining power and control over the person that you're engaged in the relationship or connection to.
So you want us to recognize the verbal abuse patterns. And, as kids, you grew up saying, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Is that really not true? We can really be hurt by name calling and verbal abuse, and it is an abuse.
It absolutely is something that can be, emotionally and mentally damaging. So, of that old adage, names can hurt me. So, while if it's an occasional thing, yes, walk away or ignore. But what we're talking about here is patterns of relating, patterns of controlling or maintaining power over someone in an ongoing relationship. And that's why I wanted to talk about these very common verbal abuse patterns.
Yeah, so let's start with name calling. It's a type of verbal abuse that's probably one of the easiest to recognize, you say?
Right. So name calling is obvious, right? Someone who is perpetually calling you names or using names and mean words to put you down or insult you. Again, it's to maintain a power imbalance. It really is, certainly yelling can be part of this as well. Aggressive phrases. I mean, we'll talk about threatening as one of the other patterns, but using name calling and insults as a way to put someone down.
Yeah, and when people are doing this, it's probably a pattern of relating that they saw or heard somewhere else. Like maybe they grew up with it. And let's say you're in a relationship and your spouse is prone to verbal abuse. Maybe not all the time, but enough that it's really starting to hurt you. How do you handle that? How do you get them to stop?
Well, I think the first step in any of these, with any of these patterns, is identifying it, right? Realizing that, oh my God, it is not okay, it is not common, it is not typical that in a relationship, and again, it could be a spousal relationship, or it could be a parent-child relationship, it could be an older parent to adult parent relationship, or adult-child relationship, and any of those relationships, name calling or verbal abuse is really damaging. So it's identifying that this is what's going on and this is how it's affecting me. That's absolutely the first step.
So identifying it means that if you're having arguments that always resort to yelling and the use of aggressive phrases, they're signs that your communication with your partner or your child is unhealthy, like you idiot, you made me angry, you. Right.
And what happens to the other person when you're it's that sort of emotional finger pointing, you idiot, you're stupid, it's really puts you on the defensive and makes you feel bad about yourself. And when that's a chronic and ongoing pattern in a relationship, it puts you in a one down. So therefore you're kind of beaten down and not able to respond in a healthy way. So it's identifying that pattern, realize how it's affecting you, and then calling attention to it.
So how would you do that if you've been living in a relationship where too often you're being criticized, or someone gets angry and it leads to yelling and name calling and intense criticism? How do you change the tide of that so that you approach this with a way that might actually work?
As we said, step one is really identifying it. Step two is acknowledging the impact that it's having on you, right? So now I've identified the pattern. It's name calling, it's intimidation, it's gaslighting, it's, emotional withdrawal. I've identified the pattern. I'm realizing that this is really making me feel terrible about myself. I feel depressed. I feel anxious. What's the effect on you? And from there, I would always want to start with a direct conversation with your partner or whoever it is that's engaging in this behavior to say, listen, when you do this, when you do X, it makes me feel bad I feel bad about myself, right? That's the I statement. When you do X, I feel bad about myself. And I need you to realize how this behavior is impacting me. If it's an ongoing pattern, it's really causing a lot of emotional damage. I really want those individuals to seek some professional help.
Okay. And if it's with your child, they're not likely going to say, Mom or Dad, when you yell at me or call me stupid, I am not able to, that makes me feel bad at myself. A child's probably not going to say that. So if you're a parent and realizing, gosh, this is a pattern I get into with my children too often. And of course, I know we all lose it. With the caveat, you always say parenting is the hardest job in the world. So if there's a parent out there that's never lost it, I'd love to meet you. I've lost that. You say things, and then hopefully you're apologizing for it. But if you find that you're saying, you're so lazy, or you're this, or you're that, first of all, how is that really detrimental to our child's development? And how do we shift it if it's become a pattern that parents feel like they're falling into too often?
In those situations, you're bringing up a really good point. Sometimes this is the way you engage in parenting because this is the way that you were parented, right? So it's really looking at what the origin is. Is someone treating you badly and then you're treating someone else badly, right? We call that displacement, right? It's sort of the anger or the frustration of the poor treatment sort of trickles down. It's being done to you and now you're displacing it onto someone else. So looking at the origin, like, wow, I'm talking to my child the way that, my parent talked to me. And I know that it made me feel terrible about myself, but yet I'm doing it. And it's that identification and then acknowledgement process, that those two steps are really, really important. I realize that parents do feel bad in a lot of these situations. What I get really concerned about is, A, that it's a repetitive pattern, but B, that there's something else, it could be substance use, it could be excessive amount of stress, that there's some other outside factor that's causing a disengagement in your logic, right? So I can logically say, when I do this, it hurts the other person. I have my logical mind. But if there's something, substance use or excessive stress or my own trauma, in that situation that's causing me not to be able to access my logical mind and therefore make changes, that's when we need to sort of break the pattern and get some outside help.
Okay. So condescension, sarcasm, you say we need to be really careful. That's belittling. That's when someone feels belittled. But also, kids don't really get sarcasm.
Yeah, being condescending. And again, I'm not talking about a little bit of sarcasm. I'm talking about chronic and what's meant to be like power imbalance sort of communication, where you're constantly using sarcasm as a way to put the other person down. Children don't necessarily understand sarcasm. Children tend to be, especially based on their developmental stage, fairly concrete. So if you're constantly using sarcasm, it's going to be confusing. They're not going to really understand what's happening. So it's easy for them to misinterpret, and therefore they're going to not respond in an appropriate way because they didn't understand what was being communicated to them in the first place.
And manipulation is always pushing someone to do or say something that makes them uncomfortable. Manipulation is a form of verbal abuse?
Yeah, yes, it is. And with manipulation, I sometimes include gaslighting in there. So gaslighting is it's a more recent term. I mean, hadn't heard of gaslighting.
You hear it all over
10 years
social
ago.
media, yeah.
Right. But really understanding what gaslighting is. Gaslighting is when someone uses a form of manipulation. It's usually over an extended period of time. And it's where someone else tries to make you question your reality. They try to tell you, no, 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 the trees are actually have blue leaves. They don't have green leaves. I can't believe how dumb you are. You think that trees have green leaves. Those leaves are blue, and like really trying to force you to question your own reality and do so in such a way that it causes harm to you, right? I mean, I'm giving a very mild example, but to gaslight you, to really use that kind of manipulation to cause you to question your reality, and then like cause you to either feel bad about yourself or apologize for something that you really haven't even done.
Yeah, and then criticism. I think we can all think of times where we haven't said things the right way, and we've certainly, maybe lashed into someone because we're angry, or maybe it's a couple thing where, tend to be neater and your spouse tends to be messier, and you're like, you're always such a mess, and blah, blah, blah. So I want you to go into this, because criticism with constructive criticism and feedback is okay. How do you know if the criticism is traumatic and wrong and not healthy?
Right. So there's a difference between, you are so disorganized and your disorganization is the reason that this house is a mess, right? That statement versus, it would be really helpful if your shoes were left by the front door and your laundry was put in the laundry basket, right? So you see how I can communicate information. I don't want things to be strewn all about the house, right? As a parent, you can communicate information, but not do it in such a way that you're really leading to kind of belittling, or it's really more constant. So I can provide information. It would be helpful if laundry was put in the laundry basket. It would be helpful if your book bag is kept in your room. It would be helpful if, right, that's a phrase actually that I got from Faber and Maslish, how to talk to children, how to talk so kids will listen and listen so kids will talk. It would be helpful if. I love that phrase. That's very different than, you're so disorganized, you're the reason this house is a mess, right? You can just feel the tone and how different that is. And again, as you said, we've all lost it. We've all been frustrated. Like, this is the 10th time I've had to tell you to put your backpack in your room, or your socks are all over the house. Can't you just put your socks in your room, right? We all get frustrated, but it's picking up on those levels of frustration for ourselves, because honestly, when we're that frustrated and angry, really no one's listening. Right.
And I think people get that frustrated because they feel like they're not listening. Like, why do people yell? Because they feel like they're not heard. And so that, I think, I do have sympathy. If you grew up in a house with parents who yelled or used their force by their voice, kind of some fear, that might be how people are going through it now, either with their partner or with their kids. What you're suggesting is there's a better way, and that we can learn how to do it differently and in a healthy way.
Yes, because there's a reason if I've said 10 times, put your backpack in your room, put your backpack in your room, put your backpack in your room, either I'm not communicating in a way that my child really understands, or something ineffective is happening. So for the most part, really finding other ways. So maybe you start to need to use consequences. If I've said, put your backpack in your room more than 2 or 3 times, I'm going to take your backpack and you're not going to be able to find it, right? And I'm going to hold on to it for a period of time. So you can use consequences as a way to manage some of this. So it's not just ad infinitum that you're asking your children to do things. But so finding more effective ways to communicate might be using consequences. It might be, your child tunes you out, and so therefore, you have to leave a note in the room. Backpack belongs in your room. So finding other ways to communicate that is helpful. Yeah. It's also sitting down with your child and saying, listen, I'm at a loss here. I don't know how to communicate this any different. Please help me.
Yeah. So what about if it's with a partner? Because so many people might be listening and thinking, yeah, my partner is not so nice to me, or when they get nasty, watch out. And they end up yelling at me and screaming at me or talking down to me. So how is it different if you're dealing with an adult and not your kid?
It's equally as concerning. I'd like it to be that with adults, there shouldn't be one individual trying to impose a power dynamic or belittling another individual. Now, that doesn't mean that sometimes your spouse doesn't remind you to, put your stuff in the laundry basket or empty the dishwasher, or do those kinds of things. A lot of things that create stress and tension and can lead to a lot of difficulty is money in relationships. Money creates a lot of power differentials. If one spouse earns more money than the other, or one manages or controls money differently, money is a big cause of conflict in a lot of relationships. So again, it's really looking at where's the source of this conflict. Sometimes I worry that, with a lot of arguing, it's not actually about the issue. It's not really about the laundry. It might be about respect. It might be about other deeper things.
Yeah.
And that's having those discussions, at a time when you're not very emotionally heated.
Right, and that will certainly cut down. But either way, we're talking about the difference between that verbal abuse is still a form of abuse. We're going to take just a quick moment to let our sponsor say something, and then we'll come back in just a second here and talk about threats and how those can show up. Take a listen.
Struggling with gambling? Wheeler Health's Better Choice program offers personalized support and treatment to help you regain control. Visit WheelerHealth.org to learn more and take the first step towards recovery today.
All right, we're back now, and that might have been appropriate, Dr. Saunders, that message was about gambling, because like you said, there could be big issues going on: alcoholism, gambling, substance abuse, all those kinds of things. Or it could just be, I hear on the internet a lot, people are becoming more aware of the narcissistic personality disorder. I hear all this time, like, how do you know you're dating a narcissist, or what a narcissist does, or why empaths and narcissists end up together. And I see that on the internet. I hear that sometimes with friends of like, gosh, this partner of mine is, I'm just questioning who I am, and they might not be physically abusing them. So we have this situation of like, it's not illegal, right? It's just mean, or it's just this.
Right.
But, you want us to understand that just because maybe you're not calling police about verbal abuse, it's still abuse.
Absolutely. Right. And Kara, I think we've done a segment on Kara's CURES on narcissists and how it impacts a relationship. So people can reference that. But, that is someone who is so self-absorbed that they have no idea how their behavior, nor do they really even care, how their behavior impacts the people around them. And that's a kind of bigger, deeper issue. If you're someone that's in a relationship with someone who at their core has that kind of narcissistic personality where they really don't have that level of empathy or care about someone else's needs or emotions, that's a very serious problem. And yes, it can, I can't necessarily call the police if someone's being verbally abusive to me, unless they're threatening, right? So threatening now, especially threatening one's life, is that crosses that line into safety. So someone who uses threats, if you don't do that, I'm going to punch you in the face. If you do X, I'm going to throw all your clothes out. Someone who uses threats on a regular basis, and whether or not they follow through with the act of threatening someone causes fear. And once you have fear instilled in you, you're not going to be able to think clearly and emotionally with less emotional arousal on how to act. Once fear is instilled in you, it will inhibit your ability to manage a situation more successfully.
So if you're living in a situation like this, where you're being criticized a lot, being threatened, gaslighting, do you need to get yourself out of it the same way you would if you were being physically abused?
I think, I always want to try to work on or repair what's there, right? I want to bring to light the patterns and how the patterns are impacting each person in the partnership. I do a lot of family therapy. We talk about some of these patterns within families. But if if this is impacting your sense of well-being and has been going on for any kind of protracted period of time and is impacting your ability to function, that I feel so terrible about myself that that I'm missing work, or that I can't hold a job, or that I don't have any emotional energy to engage in any other relationships, or I feel so bad about myself that, I've become isolated. I'm not even engaging in other friendships, right? So it's impacting the quality of my life. That those are serious red flags where you need to get some professional help, or you might need to get yourself out of that relationship.
Yeah. Blame. That is another common form of verbal abuse.
Yeah. And again, it's especially when these patterns are chronic and ongoing. Look what you made me do. You're the reason why X is happening. It's not taking responsibility for one's own role in any interaction and in any conflict. There's always two parts to that, right? It's never all one person. So when you're the person who's constantly taking the blame, I've heard someone use the phrase like you're the slapping boy, right? It's an expression. You're the one who's being blamed. You're the slapping boy in this situation. That kind of chronic verbal abuse is very, very, difficult to maintain one's sense of self-worth.
Wow. And then silent treatment. I think a lot of times people think being silent is somehow more evolved than yelling. So if you've got the silent treatment going on, you might think, well, my husband or my wife just leaving and not talking to me for a couple days while they cool down, maybe that's better. But actually, the silent treatment is a form of abuse that often goes unrecognized, you say.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm not talking about a little bit of taking space. I'm not talking about doing something where, I just need a little space to sort of think and clear my head. We're talking about ongoing withholding, emotional withholding, where you won't talk to your partner, you won't recognize their needs. This goes on for days or weeks at a time. I've worked in situations where, they said their spouse hadn't talked to them in weeks, right? To be in a living space, and especially if you're two parents, right? To be in a living space where the two parents are not speaking to one another, while you think, well, it's not yelling or screaming or blaming or criticizing, but that creates a level of emotional tension that is absolutely palpable. So you might not be screaming or yelling or blaming or criticizing, but it creates a level of emotional tension that can be felt throughout the house.
And your final point was gaslighting, which we talked a little bit about at the top of the show. But gaslighting, what it really is, because it gets a term that gets thrown around, I even hear my teens using it, but it's a form of psychological manipulation.
Yeah, you're manipulating someone and trying to make them not believe the reality, right? I gave the silly example of telling you, like, no, the leaves on that tree are blue, they're not green. It's that kind of forceful, well, okay, well, I always considered them green. Maybe they're not green. Maybe they are blue, or maybe my eyes don't see green so well, right? It makes me question my reality. So it's a level of trying to fool or trick you to not believe yourself, right? I teach young people all the time to really, know what's, your kind of intuition, what feels right for you, what feels comfortable for you. And gaslighting is where someone's constantly making you question your reality.
Yeah, okay. So if you are someone that you love is being verbally abused, you say you should seek professional help, but how do you do that? I know for physical abuse, we have hotlines for domestic violence. What do you do if you're being verbally abused?
Well, I mean, you could absolutely access a hotline for domestic violence. Realize that all towns have some type of, counseling, child and family services. Most jobs have employee assistance programs. There are places and ways to seek help and support. And I get really concerned when individuals have become isolated in their lives, because I would want someone to reach out to a family member or reach out to a friend. It's when, that verbal abuse has gotten so bad that they've become isolated. It's even more concerning because that creates safety issues.
Sure.
But to check in with someone to say, this is what's happening in my life. Does that seem like it's okay to you? To get that reality check, start with that. But to look at the services that are offered in most towns. Most jobs offer, employee assistance, calling domestic, violence hotlines. They have resources, calling 211. So InfoLine or 211 is a really important resource for communities as well.
Yeah, and sometimes if you're talking about a spouse, you may experience that this person acts perfect in front of others, but the verbal abuse is just happening behind closed doors. So it's hard for people to believe that you're having these troubles.
Right. And again, that's a form of like gaslighting. Like you say, my spouse has done this and this and this has been going on for years. And the other person says, oh, no, honey, it's probably not that bad. Right. It's probably, might you be imagining it? Right. That would be a form of gaslighting, invalidating what my reality is.
Okay.
And so you want to reach out to people that you feel connected to and who will validate what's going on with you and provide you support.
So in our final 2 minutes, I love to give people some action steps and what to walk away with. Number one, just knowing that verbal abuse is abuse. We kind of need to change the conversation around that.
Right. It is a form of abuse. It is damaging to your emotional well-being. It is very concerning when it is a chronic pattern, right? We all lose it every once in a while, but what I want to see is that if you do lose it, you recognize that and you kind of self-correct, and to really let people know that this can be damaging, and that if you're someone that's experiencing verbal abuse, you don't have to live that way.
Yeah, get help. And if you're the person doing it, maybe you're just realizing, gosh, I'm a chronic criticizer. I love my partner, but I'm not showing it the right way. I'm constantly picking, because that can happen. People can be very critical of themselves and then they take it on other people. So recognizing that pattern, that what you're doing is wrong, and then in the final minute we have together, what would you advise that person to do? Can they change it on their own? Is there something they can do to become more aware and change their habits around yelling and criticizing and verbally abusing?
Well, I do think people, when they identify and determine the effects, can change things on their own. Very often I'm concerned that it's part of a deeper pattern, right? It's part of a pattern of abuse or addiction or, family patterns, that's the way that they were treated. So they're kind of holding on to that internalized trauma. So I would want someone who, identifies that within themselves to really seek help and support as well. Because clearly that, oftentimes in situations like this, we say, you might be both the perpetrator, but you've been a victim also.
Yes.
So
we're out of time, Dr. Laura Saunders, but great wisdom as always. Thank you for helping us raise awareness. Have a great day, everyone, and be well.
CURES is sponsored by Wheeler Health's Better Choice program. More at wheelerhealth.org.